Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our second webinar in our new webinar series. My name is Lee. I'm the Chief Exec here at OCD Action. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to welcome you this evening, and I hope that everybody is sat comfortably and has a cup of tea. A question we got asked quite a bit last time was, can you see and hear us on the webinar? As panelists or speakers on the webinar, we actually can't see or hear you. So if you don't have a cup of tea or fancy going to get a drink, you're really welcome. You won't be disturbing anybody. Tonight's webinar is Exploring the Experiences of OCD, and we're really privileged to have an amazing panelist of speakers this evening. Dr. Blake Stobie will be joining us from CADAT. Lived experience speaker Olivia Bamber will be speaking, and Aron Bennett, who is well known to OCD Action from a number of roles, will also be speaking with us on our panel and as a speaker this evening. I think that evening I've had a sneak preview of a number of the slides and the talks that each speaker is going to do, and I think the evening promises to be informative and hopeful and inspiring. So I am very much looking forward to sharing the evening with you and with each of the speakers. The evening will be about 2 hours long. Each of the speakers will speak in turn, and then we will take a short break for about 10 minutes. And then all of the speakers have said that they will stay with us to take questions at the end. At the bottom of your screen, there is an opportunity to share questions. There's a button that says Q&A, and in there you can ask questions at any point. Those questions probably won't be taken. I think Dr. Stobie might take some questions or ask some questions during his talk, but most of the questions will be saved until the Q&A at the end. We might not be able to answer all of the questions. I think there's over 100 of you joining this evening. So if each of you ask 1 or 2 questions, we'll obviously have a lot of questions, but what we will do is try and take the questions most pertinent to this evening, or perhaps put 1 or 2 of those questions together to each of the panelists. But there will be a good chunk of time for questions, so please do put questions in the Q&A box. And myself and my colleagues Danielle and Kira will look at those questions and put those to the panelists. We hope everything runs really smoothly this evening, but we are on a tech platform, sorry. So if you have any issues with the tech at any point, I think my colleague now is just going to put an email address in the chat below where you can email if you have any challenges, and somebody will try and help you and get you back online or solve your issue with the tech as quickly as possible. The last couple of things I want to say is this session is being recorded. So as I mentioned, we can't see you. It's just the speaker that's being recorded. But that does mean that if your neighbor pops around and it's really important that you have a chat, or the Amazon person comes around to deliver a parcel, you're not necessarily missing out on any of the content. Of course, that also means if you feel for any reason you need to take a break from the content, you can step away and you won't miss out on the content, which I think will be really important this evening. So don't feel that this is your only chance to hear it. Just to kind of carry on that theme, it is really important to us that each of you take care of yourself. So if you do need a break, you can come back, and there will be another opportunity to hear this content. Also, if you need more information following the webinar, please do feel free to email our helpline or contact our support groups for support. And again, I think my colleague's going to share a little bit more information about how to email and contact the helpline, and more information about the support groups. Also, if you feel you need more immediate support, we don't necessarily expect anything to be triggering, but we really want everybody to feel that they're able to take care of themselves and get the support that they need. There's also information about, you know, where you can go for more immediate support if you need that this evening, and that's in the chat now. I'm going to stop speaking really shortly. You definitely didn't come and join this, give up an hour of your time, or a couple of hours of your time to hear me speak this evening. And I'm shortly going to introduce Dr. Stobie. I think Dr. Stobie might be about to put on his camera so you can all see what he looks like and wave and say hello. So it's my real privilege to introduce Dr. Stobie. Some of you will have seen him speak before. He's the head of services at the Centre for Anxiety Disorders and Trauma, often called CADAT, which is at the Maudsley. He's a highly respected CBT practitioner. We're very lucky to have him speaking to us this evening. He's really interested in CBT and the treatment of OCD, particularly ways of adapting treatment for people for whom CBT hasn't necessarily worked the first time. And he's also, I've seen him speak before, he's a really creative speaker. He's really good at communicating messages to people that sometimes can be more complex to understand. So I think we're in for a real treat this evening. And I know this is a bit odd necessarily in this kind of environment where we can't see each other, but I'd really encourage you to kind of lean in and get comfortable. And perhaps, you know, if you're sat with somebody or even if you're on your own, give Dr. Stobie a big round of applause. So thank you very much and enjoy the next few 20 minutes or so. Thank you, Dr. Stobie.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lee. And it's really, really good to be here today. I'm certainly looking forward to it too. Let me just get the presentation up. So this is here, and then that should be there as well too. Unfortunately, I can't see any of you or hear any of you. So there are a couple of points within this where I might ask you some questions. It's normally just to stop people from falling asleep. So if there is anything that you want to answer in response to those questions, apart from shouting out at your computer, do please post it in the Q&A section, and hopefully someone will be able to shout that out to me from the team today. We'd be very interested to hear from you, and it just makes it a little bit more interactive. It was a lovely introduction. This is indeed CADAT that you can see in front of you on a lovely sunny day, unlike today. And we're based at the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. We're part of the Maudsley Hospital, and we're in Camberwell in South London. And our clinic treats a number of different anxiety problems, and we have a particular specialism in helping people with OCD. I've been at the clinic now for 22 years, so I think it's a very good place to work. And I have some amazing colleagues. And part of the service that we have, as Lee mentioned, is for people with treatment-resistant OCD, where possibly they've had therapy before, medication, and they're kind of still struggling with OCD. So I managed that part of the service for a number of years, and kind of have always had a particular interest in helping people with OCD and thinking about why sometimes therapy sessions may not have helped them, or what could have kind of got in the way. In today's, this evening's webinar, I'm going to be talking very, very briefly, with sort of whistle-stop thought tour about themes and manifestations. So one of the things that I kind of find fascinating about working with OCD is the variety of different ways in which it can present. And I just want to kind of talk very, very briefly about some of the kind of presentations that you can see with an OCD. There'll be many that I won't be covering this evening, and just some of the issues to kind of be aware of from that perspective, I guess. So that's what I'll be covering today. So really an overview, I guess, of what I'm going to be going into. A little bit, first of all, about intrusions and what they are, and intrusive thoughts and obsessions. If any of you are interested, there's a TED talk that I've done on this, or TEDx talk, which you can find on YouTube if you Google my name and I think intrusive thoughts or something. So if you want to see a little bit more about that, I've lifted a couple of slides this evening from that. And then to talk about compulsions and how they're different from intrusions or obsessions. and then very briefly on contamination, because I think that's one of the more well-known kind of examples of OCD, a little bit about perinatal OCD, and then a few different versions of pure O, which people are often very interested in, touching on the themes of harm, sexuality, relationship OCD, and morality, scrupulosity, and religious thoughts. So that's the overview, I guess, of what we'll be touching on this evening. Okay, so if we start about intrusive thoughts, if you read textbooks about OCD, very often you'll get given, it'll start out with a list of intrusive thoughts, negative intrusive thoughts that people have as examples of this, and the kinds of things that will often trigger OCD in people. So am I losing it? Am I losing my mind? Could I be going crazy? Violent thoughts, I could stab my wife. I'm going to shout out, when a lot of people can relate to during the wedding, I'm going to shout out that I object during the wedding. I could throw myself off that building. That door handle is really contaminated. Maybe I'm actually enjoying having these thoughts, and a wide range of different kind of thoughts that people can have. And it's often, of course, very common for people to have a number of different themes of OCD at any one time, but often the intrusions will correspond to those particular themes that the person has. It's been really interesting to kind of see the development of treatment, psychological treatment for OCD, and how far we've kind of come within a relatively short space of time. And one of the kind of starting foundation pieces was written by Padmal de Silva and Jack Rachman in 1978. They published a paper on intrusive thoughts. And the really kind of interesting thing about this paper is, up until that point, it had always been assumed that the reason people had OCD was because they got intrusive thoughts. So it was thought that people with OCD had intrusive thoughts, and people without OCD did not get intrusive thoughts. And Padmal and Jack published this paper where they asked people without OCD whether they ever experienced a range of different thoughts, and gave them a choice to kind of select from. And they discovered that the vast majority of their sample that they asked this said, yes, indeed, we do actually get intrusive thoughts. And this was fascinating, but then kind of caused problems, because then if it wasn't kind of getting intrusive thoughts, there was a problem. Why were people developing OCD? So it kind of started this particular line of questioning, and kind of took people into some really interesting kind of places. And this study by Rachman and de Silva has been replicated in a number of different settings in different ways. Many other studies have asked people about this, and kind of putting those studies together as a composite, what you usually find is about 75% of people, so the green part of this pie chart, will usually admit to getting intrusive thoughts, and about 25% of people will say, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't get any thoughts about stabbing people or jumping out of windows or things being contaminated, etc., etc. And so researchers have always been interested, psychologists have always been interested in, what's this red bit of the pie chart? Why is it that some people seemingly don't seem to be getting intrusive thoughts? And there are a number of different theories that have been posited about this. The most uncharitable theory is really that possibly people are being slightly economical with the truth, and kind of might actually be getting intrusive thoughts, but feel too embarrassed or ashamed to kind of mention that that's the case. Personally, I think it's probably actually a little bit more complicated than that. I think because the content of people's intrusions can vary so hugely. If you say to people, do you get thoughts about stabbing somebody? They're not necessarily going to answer yes to that question, but they may be having other thoughts that they don't necessarily identify as being intrusions. So that's another very good reason, we think, why maybe about a quarter of people won't mention getting the thoughts. Also, not all people are particularly psychologically minded, or may notice the content of the thoughts that they're having, or they may get the thoughts but kind of brush them off very quickly and kind of not focus on them particularly. So intrusive thoughts or obsessions, here is a kind of bit of background which I've always kind of found really helpful about intrusions, and which I'd normally kind of go through when I'm working with someone. the most common definition, if you ask people to define intrusions, and a lot of textbooks will write about this, is people will say that intrusions are unwanted thoughts. And of course, that's absolutely true. Many intrusions that people have are deeply unwanted thoughts, extremely unpleasant or anathema to the person having them. But I would argue very strongly that the definition of intrusions is actually much broader than that. Yes, intrusions can be unwanted thoughts, most certainly, and many of the thoughts that trip people up are very unpleasant and unwanted. But really, for me, the defining feature of an intrusion would be to say that they're unplanned or uncontrollable thoughts, not necessarily unwanted thoughts. So thoughts we didn't plan to have would constitute an intrusion. So again, within the literature, often it's referred to as negative thoughts, unpleasant thoughts, horrible thoughts people are having. So for example, stabbing people or getting contaminated. But you can also have kind of positive intrusions. So while I'm sitting talking to you, I might suddenly have an intrusive thought pop into my head about all the kind things Lee was saying earlier. And that might kind of give me a bit of a warm glow, and I might feel very happy about that. And that would be an intrusion, not because it's unpleasant or unwanted, but because it's not what you want me to be chatting about or thinking about right now. So the thoughts just popped into my head. And similarly, I might also get a neutral intrusion, like I really need to remember to post that letter later this evening. Again, it's not something you really want me to be having thoughts about while I'm talking to you about this stuff. So those would be intrusions, positive, negative, and neutral. So they're not all negative, and they're not necessarily therefore unwanted. Intrusions actually sometimes get a bit of a bad rap. So I would argue very strongly that they're part of our imaginations. Can you imagine someone like Stephen King or some other kind of fiction writer being unable to experience intrusions and have these random kind of thoughts pop into your head? Intrusions can actually kind of be useful in terms of helping our imaginations, or be a very important part of the imagination. And part of the reason for that is exactly what makes them so difficult to deal with, is that by definition, they cannot be censored. We can't get rid of these thoughts. We can't stop ourselves from having them or prevent ourselves from having them. And so imagination wouldn't really kind of work if you would think to yourself, well, I have all the nice fluffy thoughts and the friendly thoughts, but none of these horrible, violent thoughts or sexually inappropriate thoughts. We don't get to choose, unfortunately. They kind of come as a package deal. I would argue quite strongly, no study has managed to, I think, successfully find this yet, but that intrusions are kind of part of the human condition. So 100% of us get intrusions. And if we then think by extension, what percentage of people get very inappropriate thoughts or shameful thoughts or embarrassing thoughts, very rude thoughts, I would argue again, that's going to be 100% of people, even if possibly only 75% of people will fess up to that, really. So this is the first bit where you're welcome to type some polite non-intrusions into the Q&A if you'd like to. And in this first situation, it's a bit of a thought experiment. I would like you to picture yourself going into a situation without this intention and accidentally bumping into someone who you find very attractive. So you find someone extremely attractive, you happen to look up and you see this very attractive person there, and you have a sudden intrusive thought pop into your head about how attractive that person is. You didn't go there for that purpose, that wasn't why you were there, but you can't help but notice this person and how attractive they are. For those of you who are like me and don't have a particularly well-developed visual imagination, I have a nice bit of material here for you if you're struggling to think of someone really attractive. So there's a kind of bit of a jog for your memory. The question that I have for you is really, like, would this be a positive, negative, or neutral intrusion? Ignore Putin, like it doesn't have to be about Putin. But if you had a sudden thought pop into your head about someone really attractive, would that be a positive, negative, or neutral intrusion that you had? I don't know if there's any kind of, if you do have any sort of views on that, you can just type positive, negative, neutral. It'd be helpful to hear maybe from one of my colleagues what's kind of coming through, whether most people think that's positive, negative, neutral. I don't know if that's kind of coming through in the Q&A.
A couple of people have said all of those things maybe.
Okay.
A
Yeah.
couple of people have said neutral.
Okay. Okay.
A couple of people have said it depends. Some people have said positive.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Great.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Super. Okay. So that's really good. And what's quite fun is like all of these experiments I tend to sort of run on psychology students as guinea pigs. So I ask them, I give them the same picture and tell them to imagine the same situation. And usually most of the time, the psychology students will say, ignoring Putin and kind of putting them to one side. That would probably be a neutral or positive kind of intrusion. Some people say, well, it depends on your situation, what you make of it, if you're married or not, and if the person you have an intrusions about is your partner. But, you know, usually most people kind of find that like a sort of neutral to positive kind of intrusion to have. Here's our second thought experiment. You go to another social situation. Again, you haven't gone there for this particular purpose. And you happen to look up and see someone within the situation who looks very attractive again. And it looks like possibly they're kind of looking at you. And you have a sudden thought pop into your head about how attractive they are. But the problem is this time around, you're actually at someone's funeral. So you're there at the funeral, it's meant to be a very sad occasion, and you've had this sudden intrusive thought about this attractive person that you've just noticed. Any takers on this? Do you think it still depends? Do you think it's negative, positive, neutral? What do people think? People are always a little bit slower with this one. Okay, they're coming in now. What are people saying, Lee?
So some people have said neutral.
Yeah.
A couple of people have said that it's more negative this time. Some people have said very negative or negative. So yeah, a lot more in that negative.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you. So that's a really good illustration of this effect. And again, with the psychology students, we get this even more pronounced. So in the first situation, the psychology students are pretty much overwhelmingly neutral to positive. And in this particular situation, they're sort of 90% will say this is negative. This is a very terrible thought to be having. And of course, as I think many of you have kind of worked out, it's really a trick question. Like in both situations, the thought itself is intrinsically neutral. It doesn't have a kind of positive or negative value until we start to ascribe one to it. And that we think is really when OCD starts to take root, is when we start to attach meaning to our intrusions and start to think of them both as a sign that something terrible could happen, that we could be responsible for it in some way, and therefore that we need to do something in response to those thoughts when we have them. But I would argue still then it would be much better really instead to think about intrusions as a kind of spam. And we're walking around all day getting bombarded by these spammy kind of thoughts. All of us get them, and most of the time we kind of ignore them completely. We have built-in spam filters in our brains which filter out the spammy thoughts and kind of prevent them from sort of interfering with what we're doing. Occasionally, however, a spammy thought will work its way into our inbox, marked high priority. You really need to attend to this. This is very, very important. And we may not recognize actually that it's spam. We may think of it as a high priority email that needs to be attended to. And when that happens, that's when we start to get into specific kind of OCD content of the kind that we're about to sort of look at now. So that was obsessions or intrusions, if you like. So the sort of mental thoughts that kind of come up, which may be perceived as negative and kind of give us a sense something terrible might happen, I might be responsible, I need to do something. And then the compulsions on the other side can be physical or mental acts. They're done in response to the intrusions in order to try to prevent or minimize harm. And there's always going to be a meaningful link between the person's obsessions and their compulsions, even though that may be idiosyncratic to the person who's doing them. So sometimes if you're seeing someone stare at a light for hours and sort of saying, is that definitely off? It may seem like quite a strange compulsion, but it will be very clearly linked to the obsessional thought that the person has had. in terms of the diagnostic systems, you can be diagnosed with OCD if you have either obsessions or compulsions, but to my mind, there will always be both. I've never met anyone who has just obsessions or just compulsions, and that becomes really important when we look in a moment at Pure O and how Pure O kind of works. So one of the first kind of sort of subtypes of OCD, I guess, and probably the most well-known, the one that kind of everyone sort of reads about and kind of hears about, is contamination OCD. I'm not going to talk too much about this because of that. It's sometimes triggered by actual contamination. So some of the things people worry about are kind of genuinely contaminated, asbestos, dog poo, etc., etc. Or it might also be perceived contamination, which might be kind of triggering it. It can also be triggered by feelings of contamination due to association. So what we might kind of refer to as mental contamination. So some of the clients I've worked with have had very bad experiences of being bullied at school, and the school itself becomes a sort of source of perceived contamination. So anything that comes into contact with the school seems as if it's contaminated and could kind of spread unpleasant kind of feelings as well. So it's not just about a kind of physical contamination. One of the things that you kind of notice in therapy sessions is sometimes your clients will be worried about contamination of door handles, and you might notice on a good day the person can touch a door handle fairly easily. On a bad day they may not be able to, and I think one of the reasons for that might be as well, it's not just the thoughts that the person, it's not just the actual touch in the door handle that's the problem, but what thoughts that person's having at the same time. So what we try to do in response to this is to help people to physically expose themselves to the thing they're worried about. So in this case, the door handle, at the same time as trying to bring on the thoughts about contamination too, so that they can do it under any conditions when they need to. So really with the contamination, it's kind of very much like an exposure-based task. We sort of needs to be repeated consistently and ideally sort of tried under a variety of different conditions to be successful. Perinatal OCD, not necessarily like a subtype of OCD per se, but increasingly being recognized as a time of particular vulnerability for people for all kinds of reasons. So new mothers and indeed parents will have this heightened responsibility. You've been given a child and often sent home the same day or the next day. You've never had a child before, and suddenly you're the solely responsible person for that person's child's well-being, a baby's well-being, and keeping them alive and feeding them. And generally there hasn't been much in the way of kind of instructional manuals on how to do that, and the manuals are often very different from what's actually going on in reality. Also a time of great uncertainty, significant life changes, hormonal changes. Mothers may not be taking medication if they're previously on it. So lots of reasons why perinatal period and postnatal period is an area of particular vulnerability for parents and particularly mothers of people. The thoughts here within this perinatal OCD often focus on thoughts of harm or doing something inappropriate to a child. But it also might be some more generalized worries about making mistakes that kind of linked into this heightened responsibility in that time. And other people then kind of worrying about that and responding to the thoughts of, if someone's sort of seeking reassurance or saying, I've just had this thought about harming my child, can make other people around them extremely anxious as well too, triggering safeguarding concerns, and that can then exacerbate the entire situation very quickly. So that's why it's very, very helpful to kind of have people who are aware of OCD and are able to help and intervene very quickly. Part of our clinic, Fiona Chalakum, who was working with us and has unfortunately kind of left fairly recently, set up a perinatal anxiety service within the clinic, and we still have therapists within our clinic who have a parental anxiety treatment program. The charity Maternal OCD is also a very good resource for people seeking help with this if they have perinatal or postnatal OCD. So mainly the therapy is focusing on helping people to reduce avoidance, gain confidence in looking after their baby, and being able to tolerate the distressing thoughts, even if these are really, again, very, very unpleasant to have to deal with. So Pure O, I've kind of put it in inverted commas, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware. there's a fair bit of controversy over that term. And part of it, I think, really is it's not particularly accurate kind of term. So it's called puro for pure obsessionality, meaning you're just getting lots of intrusive thoughts. But again, in line with what I was saying earlier, most of the people you see with puro are really kind of compulsively ritualizing. They're going over things in their head, they're trying to work them out. So there are a lot of compulsions that take place within puro. It's just that they happen to be internal to the person. One of the problems with this, a lot of therapists and people with OCD regard pure OCD as a more difficult subtype to treat. I personally don't think that's the case, other than, of course, the therapist's pessimism or sometimes therapists' lack of training in this area. But when you know what you're doing, it works exactly the same as other kinds of OCD as well. Apart from the fact that kind of standard types of CBT are often not particularly helpful for OCD. So the very conventional type of OCD, which is used for treating depression, is often about helping people to sort of dispute their thoughts and kind of argue with the thoughts and come up with more helpful ways of thinking. And it's very, very easy for that style of CBT to become counterproductive, to become a ritual in its own right. So it's very important for therapists to be aware of that and to not fall into those traps when helping people with pure O. There's a number of kind of further subtypes within pure O that kind of work within this way. And the most common one I would say was about harm, particularly kind of harming other people. Obviously, when people are worrying about things, they tend to gravitate towards the worst thing they could possibly imagine. And for most people, the worst thing they could possibly think about would be causing harm to a child. So personally, probably the most common area of OCD that I tend to see is people who are worried about harming children, that they might sexually abuse children or cause harm to children in some way, which is obviously a very horrific kind of content area for people to be worried about. Makes people feel very ashamed. Secretive is not very well written about. It's given how common it is, there's very little in the literature about this, and this can cause people to be very concerned, understandably, and to think possibly this isn't OCD or something else, and makes it harder to disclose and to seek therapy too. Or sometimes people may find themselves over-disclosing and reassurance seeking. And again, if you have someone that you're disclosing to who's not particularly psychologically minded or doesn't know about OCD, that can again cause concern in those people as well too. The other thing that kind of gets mentioned quite a lot here is just this idea of groinal response. So often what people are doing is that they are focusing attention on their groins to see whether they're having any kind of physical response to the thoughts that they're having. Am I getting aroused? Am I being turned on? And this really kind of then the focusing of attention on that area of the body actually causes some sensations within the groin. And that then, of course, causes people to be extremely worried because they take that as a sign that actually they might be enjoying these thoughts or want to have them in some way. So this is very, very common. And again, I wish more was kind of written about this to kind of help people to sort of understand that this is not a sign that they're enjoying these thoughts in any kind of way. Sexuality. So some people kind of worry that they might, for example, identify as being straight, but then start to worry that they might be gay and kind of spend a lot of time ruminating and dwelling on this, particularly where people have grown up in family environments where they may feel that their parents would object to that or be worried about that, concerned about that. Sexuality, I think, is a really interesting example because it's a kind of OCD content that isn't really particularly testable. So a lot of pure O lands on thoughts or worries which aren't testable. There's no way of knowing. You can't kind of take a test to work these out, to kind of figure it out conclusively. And that's, of course, very fertile ground for OCD. So check-in, again, is very common in response to this. Check-in physical responses, how attracted you are to one gender compared to another. And sometimes people will also kind of view pornography as a way to kind of check this as well too. And that's quite a slippery slope, I think, because once you start to check that, you can get very, very kind of muddled and increasingly more and more anxious as well too. Relationship OCD or ROCD. So these kind of intrusions here might be, do I still love my partner? Do I still find them attractive? Am I being selfish and staying with them? I should say them, sorry. Sometimes it could actually be slightly complicated by an actual ambivalence or some kind of concerns within the context of the relationship too, which can make it even harder for people to disentangle. And again, within this, although it's termed a kind of pure O, you'll see lots of mental checking or reassurance seeking. And this can sometimes cause damage within the relationship itself too, because if you sort of say to your partner, you know, I've been looking at you recently and I'm really not sure whether I do find you as attractive as I used to, you have to be fairly thick-skinned to be able to tolerate that kind of degree of reassurance seeking within your relationship as well. Morality or scrupulosity. So people may feel it's morally wrong to stand up to the OCD. So often people may not seek out treatment, or they may find it hard to engage with treatment. So someone I used to work with would worry that if she sat down, she might sit on a microorganism. And so to her, it just wasn't worth standing up to OCD because she'd be causing harm to living organisms. So she made the determination that really wasn't worthwhile for her. Or for someone with religious compulsions, it might feel like what people have been asked to do in therapy is blasphemous or endangering others. Often though, when you look at it, these sort of thoughts that people have are based on very idiosyncratic personal interpretations of religion. So one of my clients worked with is Muslim, and she was very worried about eating bananas which were overly ripe in case the ripened banana had some sort of traces of alcohol in it. But that was kind of, the rest of her family didn't agree with that particular interpretation she was placing on it. So that's the kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the different kind of types. But in case this sort of all makes things seem a lot more complicated, my question to you now, again, quick one for the Q&A. What do you think these two cars have got in common? Any takers on that? Got a red sports car on the right and the nice blue Volvo 7-seater car on the left. Any guesses as to what they've got in common? Looks like a couple of people, yeah, a few people. What are people going for, Lee?
They're all cars, they all have 4 wheels.
Yeah, it's true.
4 wheels. Yeah, they've all got wheels.
Yeah.
Somebody said that they're all expensive cars.
Yes, that's true. Well, the thing I was going for actually is that they both have exactly the same engine. So both of these cars, bizarrely, you wouldn't think it to look at them, but they both have the same engine. And really, I suppose, you know, in the slightly clunky metaphor, what I'm trying to get at is that all of these different types of OCD, the content may change quite a lot, but the way in which they work is the same. And once you're a mechanic and you know how the engine works, it can be fixed in the same kind of way too. You can kind of make changes in the same sort of way. So you don't have to get too kind of caught up on, is it a sports car, is it red, is it this or the other. You want to kind of focus, I guess, on the process of how the problem works and how to kind of work on that rather than just the content. So how do we kind of treat pure OCD? You can help people to sort of face their frightening thoughts. So doing a loop tape, quite an old school behavioral technique, but very effective, kind of done right. You can help people to practice non-engagement with thoughts, often as part of that process. You'd obviously be trying to help them cut out unhelpful strategies, like checking or reassurance seeking. And of course, whenever you've got an uncertain situation, there's 2 ways of dealing with uncertainty. You can either try to become more certain, or you can get better at tolerating uncertainty. And of course, I tend to favor the latter approach. It's always better to try to build up a tolerance of uncertainty where you possibly can. And that is my presentation for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stobie. I think there were so many parts of that were just so helpful. I think from your description of intrusions and intrusive thoughts to your honesty actually about the challenges that people will face living with Puro and maybe with reaching out and accessing treatment, but just your clarity about the treatability of Puro and different manifestations of OCD, I think is so helpful. So thank you ever so much. We're all incredibly grateful. I wish you could hear the round of applause that I'm sure is going around living rooms across the UK right now. We're next going to introduce Olivia Bamber to speak to us. Olivia is really well known to OCD Action. She used to be an employee at OCD Action, and I hope she's there. Everyone can see her waving, I think, now. And she moved on a little while ago now, probably a couple of years ago, to a new role, but she still volunteers on our helpline, so she's incredibly well qualified to speak to you. She is a really good speaker. She has had OCD since she was young, but due to I think she will cover in her presentation some good treatment and support. She manages her OCD well now and is in a good place with that. Olivia is a really good campaigner around OCD and has spoken. I have seen her speak amazingly to the media and on podcasts and on many different videos and talks. So we will have a really good next 20 minutes as Olivia shares her story with us. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Olivia to speak to us all this evening. So please do give her a big round of applause from your home. And thank you ever so much, Olivia.
Thank you very much. I'm really hopeful that my Wi-Fi is going to hold out, because it can be a little bit sketchy sometimes, but fingers crossed you can all hear and see me okay. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you, as it says on the screen, about my experiences of contamination OCD and all of the bits in between, because it very much has been a mixture of OCD themes through the year, but contamination has kind of been the one that's always been really at the forefront. So yeah, just before I start, I did want to just give a very small trigger warning that I will talk very lightly about depression in a little while, and intrusive thoughts, sort of around like suicidal thoughts. So I just wanted to put a little warning on there in case that content might be difficult for anybody to hear. But yeah, I will start at the beginning of my OCD experiences, because that seems like a good place to start. So I am 32 now, but I recognise OCD behaviours back from when I was 7 or 8 years old. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 16, but sort of thinking back now, I can sort of attribute some behaviours which I just thought were childhood rituals to probably the early signs of OCD symptoms. When I was 7 or 8, I had lots of habits, lots of, I guess, idiosyncrasies that many children will have. I think probably all children will have, you know, sort of lining teddies up before you go to bed, kissing them all goodnight, things like that. These things didn't cause me distress at the time, but they were things that I did have to do. I have a really clear memory, actually, of every time the microwave was on, you know, when it's sort of counting down the minutes, of having to sort of tap various different things in my kitchen and do a certain dance in a certain order before the microwave finished. And if I didn't do it within that time, if I didn't complete this ritual, I had to do it again and again until I got it right. Now, this didn't cause me any distress, and there wasn't necessarily an intrusive thought behind that, but there was this feeling of not rightness is kind of the only way I can describe it. And actually, now sort of working on the OCD Action helpline, I do hear a lot of parents sort of talk about, you know, younger children having this feeling of not right. They can't necessarily say what the intrusive thought is, but it just feels like something you have to do. And that's kind of how it started for me. This did progress sort of into my, I guess, early teens, into intrusive thoughts around stopping bad things from happening. Now, those bad things started as, I guess, less bad things, like, you know, oh, I don't want anyone to fall out, and so I'll do this ritual to stop my friends from falling out. But then they turn into more sinister intrusive thoughts. Like if I saw a car crash on TV, I would think, okay, I have to do a certain ritual to stop someone else having a car crash. And then it would be to stop a loved one from having a car crash. So the rituals did start to have more of a thought behind them and more anxiety behind them. And I guess more of a risk if I didn't do them. So I continued to do them because it felt like it wasn't worth taking the risk. Now, obviously, logically, at the time, I knew that as a 12, 13-year-old, I couldn't stop a bad thing from happening, from, you know, jumping up and down a certain amount of times or tapping things in a certain order. but it didn't feel worth the risk. And I guess that's the kind of that what if part of OCD. You know, what if I don't do it this time and something bad does happen? I'll just do it because it doesn't take very long and it's not worth the risk. Of course, we know that over time, you know, every time you do that, that cycle is building and building, and over time that will start to become something that is very time consuming, which it did for me, and it did develop into contamination related fears. When I was 15, my father fell ill and unfortunately passed away when I was 16. And I could see when he was in hospital, I could see the hospital from my bedroom window. And I remember, you know, repeating phrases over and over before I went to bed about, you know, keeping him safe, and doing various sort of tapping behaviours, you know, to kind of, while I was looking at the hospital, to keep him safe. And although I didn't think this at the time, I guess maybe subconsciously, when he did pass away, maybe there was something subconsciously where my OCD was like, oh, you didn't do enough and that bad thing happened, so now you need to do more and more to keep other people safe. I don't remember consciously thinking that at the time, but I think subconsciously that must have been the case, because my OCD quickly spiraled from there, really. And like I said, it did turn into contamination based intrusive thoughts. I'd just like to stop for a minute now and stop kind of talking about my experiences, I guess, and talk a little bit more about contamination OCD in more detail. And I guess a few of the kind of myths, Blake did touch upon some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, like very briefly, but a lot more eloquently than I will do. But yeah, just a few things that I guess I think about contamination OCD, because it is one of the more well-known forms of OCD. I think if you spoke to a person on the street and said, what is OCD? You know, they probably would mention contamination-based intrusive thoughts, because they are things that are more well spoken about. But I still think there's a huge amount of myths there, and I've seen so many over the years from my personal experience. The first one on the list is not just hand washing. Absolutely not. You know, OCD in general encompasses so many different themes and compulsions, as Blake very eloquently spoke about. It isn't just about hand washing, but where hand washing is a compulsion, it's not just wanting, you know, your hands to be nice and clean. It's painful, it's time consuming. For me, I've had years and years of painful cracked hands, of sleeping over at friends' houses and wearing gloves to make sure my hands didn't bleed on the sheets, and, you know, hours and hours of agony and washing away something that isn't there but feels like it is there. So, you know, it isn't just about hand washing, but that can be a part of it, but a very, very painful part of it. I've not picked the best picture here. There is a picture here of me washing my hands. This was a really actually very painful day. I remember spending hours actually showering and washing my hands at this point. I'm not quite sure why there's a photo of it, but yeah, it, you know, there's a lot of pain there, I guess, behind that smile, because you know, for me, it really, really felt like something terrible was going to happen if I didn't get myself clean. Number two on the list here I put is the fear behind the rituals. With contamination OCD, often you can see a lot of the rituals that you're doing, you know, the washing, the cleaning, whatever it might be, and the avoiding touching certain things. But it's the fear that drives that, and the fear behind that can vary hugely. I've spoken to lots of people who have contamination-based fears around getting ill or dying. That's not the case for me. My contamination fears revolve around things that smell bad. And if I touch something that smells bad, will that make me smell? Will everybody hate me? Will I be alone for the rest of my life? You know, that's kind of how it escalates for me. So the fear behind the rituals can be very different. There can be mental and physical rituals. I've mentioned some of the physical ones, but some of the mental ones can be going over and over in your head for hours at a time about what have you touched, where have you spread the bad things from and to. And, you know, I actually have a very good memory now from spending hours and hours a day when I was really unwell of thinking what I'd touched and what needed to be thrown away, and trying to remember months and months back about something that might have happened one day. So there's a lot of mental rituals involved there. Reassurance seeking is a huge one as well, which I know comes along for many people with many different themes of OCD. Number 7, as it says, is illogical. It is a logical number there. It's an illogical disorder. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And I've popped a picture here of me paragliding. You know, for a lot of people, heights would be a legitimate fear. It's not a fear for me. Not a problem at all to jump off a cliff in a paraglide. But sitting on a bus seat is a completely different story. You know, touching a shopping trolley, a completely different story. Opening a can of tuna, incredibly difficult. But something that would, you know, seem to be more scary, like paragliding, it just, you know, it doesn't bother me at all. I once spoke to a friend about the illogicalness of my OCD by saying, I won't touch the rail on an escalator. I'd lick it because I'm not worried about getting ill, but I won't touch it. Now, obviously, I won't actually do that, but that's the illogicalness, is that I didn't want to touch it with my hand because I felt the smell could spread onto my hand. But I'm not worried about the germs on it. That doesn't bother me at all personally. And that's where, you know, OCD is can be really illogical. Number 5 on there, I've put not in isolation. I have contamination-based fears, but I also have checking intrusive thoughts about worrying about being a bad person or upsetting someone or causing someone harm. So, you know, like Blake said, you can often have one sort of main presenting theme of OCD, but then lots of other things that go alongside that. So yeah, I hope that just sort of gives you a little whistle-stop tour of my sort of main things about contamination OCD that I wanted to get across. So jumping back to my experiences of living with OCD, I went through my teenage years with the contamination fears getting progressively worse and worse. I went through 2 failed rounds of therapy. They didn't work because I wasn't willing to engage with them. I'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail soon. By the time I hit university, I guess what should be the best kind of years of your life, and sometimes they were, but they were also incredibly painful. By the time I reached university, I'd pretty much completely lost my independence. I was struggling to shower on my own, go to the toilet on my own. I was withholding the amount I drank or ate for the fear of using the toilet. I was spending hours a day in the shower, bottles of shower gel at a time, you know, throwing all my clothes away because I thought they were too dirty for the washing machine. I was pretty much unable to see a future without OCD. And the screenshot at the bottom there is a little screenshot from a journal I kept at the time, which ironically I couldn't write in a lot of the time because I felt too dirty to write in it. And at this point, it wasn't about the world being contaminated. It was about me contaminating the world. I felt like I was this source of disgust and I was going to just make everything dirty. So I often confined myself to my room, often spent, you know, hours, if not days in bed, you know, waiting for a friend who I lived with to come home and so I could shower and they could help me shower or help me go to the toilet. And it really was quite a painful like existence, not to sound dramatic, but at the time I couldn't see a future without OCD. I was diagnosed with clinical depression because of the OCD, and yeah, I just couldn't see a way out. The reassurance seeking, the dependence on other people, it was all too much. And you might wonder why I'm telling you all of this quite dark stuff. But I guess the picture on the next slide is, you know, what I kind of want to get across is that it did get to the depths of being so awful that I couldn't see a way of living with it. And I just wanted it to go away. I desperately wanted it to go away. But I did get better from it. And I guess what I want to get across is that no matter how difficult it gets, and no matter how many years you've lived with OCD, I think at this point I had it for 14 years, it can get better. It absolutely can get better. I can confidently say that from experience. And there is very, very cheesy light at the end of the tunnel. And that's kind of what I wanted to get across here. And I'll move on now, I guess, to talk about how I achieved that, and some, I guess, tips that I would share from my experiences. I've titled this slide "If at First You Don't Succeed," and I think try again is definitely an accurate description of what I did. You can see here I've got on the left sort of the OCD intensity and the bottom time. It's not a very mathematical graph, but bear with me. I did try CBT numerous times. My family were very concerned about me when I was a teenager, and they did send me to, well, encourage me to go to therapy and help me get to that place. I was a typical teenager. I didn't want to admit that there was something wrong. I didn't engage with the therapy. It's not because they were bad therapists. It just wasn't the right time. I didn't understand what was happening, and I didn't understand how therapy was going to help me get any better. It was too hard. And it is really, really hard. It's not easy to do, but living with OCD is so much harder. And so I went through many years, and it was a long process. This makes it look like a nice, easy process to get therapy. I appreciate that's certainly not the case. Often it was a long process, but at that high point there, that was the point that I had completely given up on myself. And it was only speaking to loved ones, to my mum, to my sister, to my friends I was living with at the time at university, where they were saying, you know, I'm going to have to give up university to look after you, or I'm going to have to move to Newcastle to help look after you, that I realised the impact that it was having on other people. And I thought, well, I've given up on myself, but I don't want to give up on these people, and so I'll give it one more go. And I self-referred for cognitive behavioural therapy with exposure response prevention, a long name, and I went on medication. And it did take a few different medications to find the one that worked for me. But that CBT, because I was willing to give it a go for other people, and I properly engaged and I threw everything into it, that really made quite a life-changing difference. And you'll see after that one, the intensity of OCD did go down, and I did start to regain my independence. As you can see from the next few sort of up and downs, I think anybody would say that a journey with OCD and getting better from it is not straightforward. It's not necessarily that, you know, you have some help and then that's it, you're good to go. CBT does teach you how to be your own therapist, and it does help you massively with that. But I still felt I needed some help. I'd come from such a dark place, and I was really working on myself, but I didn't have that community of people. I didn't know anybody else with OCD, and that's when my sister saw an advert for a program in America where they were going to send some young people to America for an intense OCD camp. And I thought, at this point, what have I got to lose? No one knew about my OCD apart from the people I lived with. You know, to other people out and about, they probably wouldn't have even known, because I guess I think high functioning is the word that you use when you know, I was still attending university, I was still getting out and about, but in this really dark place inside. And I applied for this program, and I got a place on it. And that's where I met all the people with OCD for the first time. 5 amazing people who I still speak to on a daily basis. And that massively changed things. Having people where you can say, oh, I've got to do that, it's my OCD, and they just get it. Just for me was just massive. It really, really helped. And then following on from that, you'll see on the chart here, I have had top-up CBT sessions, most recently only a couple of years ago. And that's not because I don't have the tools now, because I really feel like I do have this fantastic toolkit of information about how to fight OCD. But sometimes you just need, you need some extra support with that. Sometimes a different theme will crop up, and it certainly has done for me. And there's just something else that you need to work on with help. And that's kind of what I always say to people on the helpline when I'm taking calls is, like, you're entitled to as much help as you need. It's not always easy to get, and that's kind of why charities like OCD Action exist, to help people get to that place. But you absolutely deserve it, and so you should fight to get that treatment that you deserve, even if you've had some in the past, because you might need some more help with that. I'm going to finish by talking just a little bit about looking kind of forwards, the things that I do now on a day-to-day basis to try and keep well, to keep in a good place. And I couldn't resist popping a picture of my puppy in here. This relates to one of the points further down the list, challenging yourself every day. I feel like I manage my OCD well now. I've definitely regained my independence. I feel like I do manage it well, but I still have to battle it every day. Even before this call, I was in the shower, and because I was anxious, I couldn't get myself out of the shower. And I had to just really, really challenge myself to get out and just be like, no, it's not gonna win. It's not gonna stop me from joining this webinar, because it does, it does still crop up every day, but it's just about constantly challenging yourself. And that's why my partner and I got a dog, but it's not the only reason why. I mean, she's very cute. But yeah, it's to challenge yourself. As dogs bring in all sorts, they roll in all sorts, and these are things that I do find massively triggering. But it is a challenge every day, but it's a challenge worth, it's worth it, and it's worth having something that OCD would have once taken away from me. And that keeps me kind of going with those CBT techniques every day. Recognizing OCD, and what I mean by this is, I guess, when I get an intrusive thought, labeling it as, okay, that's an OCD intrusive thought. This is what OCD is trying to make me do today. This is not a rational thought. And then dealing with it in a way that I would in a CBT session, an ERP session. I find that really helps. Getting loved ones on board is massive. And like I said earlier, reassurance seeking was a huge problem for me. And it still can be on a day-to-day basis, but reassurance seeking in the short term, obviously, it does bring you that relief, but at the end of the day, it is another compulsion. But getting your loved ones on board and bringing them to therapy sessions with you, or my most recent sessions, my therapist recorded the sessions, and then my partner Freddie was able to listen to them back when I got home. So he was able to kind of know, okay, these are the exercises you're doing this week, and this is how I can help support you with that. That's been a massive support. And something else we did, and I don't know whether Dr. Stobie, whether you'd agree this is a good thing or not, that we kind of came up with I guess a quota between myself and my partner on like how much reassurance I was allowed to ask for. And, you know, before my most recent round of therapy, it was you're allowed to ask for one bit of reassurance a day. And that really helped me think, okay, I'm panicking on this. Can I deal with this on my own? And if I absolutely can't, then I've got that one bit to fall back on. And then we reduced that down over time. So it was one a week, one every 2 weeks, one a month. And now if I ask for reassurance, you know, I won't necessarily get it because I'm challenging myself constantly, and my loved ones are helping me to challenge that. And I find that massively helpful. Meeting others with OCD, as I described, it's a huge help. And you can do that through OCD Action support groups and various things like that, which I think is really, really helpful. I put here accepting help. Don't be a martyr like me and think that you know it all. I remember there was a point where I was working at OCD Action and I'd started to feel quite unwell again. And I thought, I've done CBT before. I know how to do this. I work at an OCD charity. I don't need I can't go back and get any more help. No one can help me. I've got to help myself. Sometimes you just have to accept help. Sometimes you need that guidance of how to challenge yourself, someone to go back to and feedback to. And yeah, I would always say, even if you have that toolbox, you have that support around you, if you need that extra help, it's really important to just go back and ask for it. I spoke there about challenging yourself already, and I've popped OCD Action on the end. They didn't ask me to put that there, but I genuinely think the resources at OCD Action are a complete lifeline for people with OCD, for friends and family. I mentioned there about sometimes it can feel difficult to access therapy and the support that you need. And that's why OCD Action exists, to help people get to the right place and to help support you in that and provide you with the right information you need to get the help that you deserve. So yeah, I really would utilise all of the help that they have to offer. And I'm going to leave you there. Thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Fingers crossed you could hear me throughout. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Olivia. I just want to say a big thank you on behalf of everybody who was listening. I think your openness and honesty shows a huge generosity of spirit. I think what you will have done there will have been incredibly helpful to loads of people and just will have inspired so much hope. So thank you ever so much. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you at the end. So thank you. And I hope you stick around for the question panel after the break. It's our next speaker who will be joining us is Aron Bennett. I hope Aron is there and I can't see him at the moment, but I hope he's there to give everybody a big wave. Aron is an author of a memoir called The Walking Worried. Aron has also been involved with OCD Action for many years, initially as a support group leader and then as an OCD Action trustee, which made him my boss for a good while. So I need to say nice things about him, but I would do that anyway because Aron is an amazing and passionate advocate, and he's worked to raise awareness around OCD, particularly around those lesser known areas that Dr. Stobie was talking around during his presentation, particularly areas such as moral scrupulosity, which I think it says on the slide you can see now is what Aron will be particularly talking about. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Aron to you and welcome him. So let's give him a huge round of applause, and please do listen carefully, as I'm sure Aron will have some amazing things to say. Thank you and welcome, Aron.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for that very generous introduction. As you can see, as the slide is titled Moral Scrupulosity, that will be the subject and has been my main manifestation of OCD for many, many years. I guess what I hope to achieve in talking more about moral scrupulosity is countering something that I'm going to mention a little later on, in just how difficult it is actually to talk about moral scrupulosity for various different reasons. So I hope that in offering myself up as an example, I can help elucidate or shine some light on the sub type that is moral scrupulosity. So probably not untypically, my OCD began in childhood, and the very first rituals I can remember having were to do with checking if the tap was off. And I had this fear that the tap was dripping, and I would have to get out of bed and I'd have to check over and over again. And eventually this behaviour, I was about 10 years old, caught the attention of both my parents, who could hear the sort of restless pitter-patter of footsteps across the landing. And they asked me to come down one evening, and in front of me, they presented this book of how babies were made. And they skipped the first few chapters on conception, rightfully so, so I was only 10. And they showed me all these pictures of fetuses, of embryos, to try and distract me, to try and sort of give me something else to think about. And there were these wonderful, really sort of super resolution versions of fetuses that were doing all sorts of things like grimacing and stuff like that. And as far as I was concerned, they could have been doing the can or writing the full works of Shakespeare, because actually all I cared about, even while I was being told all of these wonderful things about how life begins, all I could think about was the fact that the tap was dripping upstairs. So of course my rituals continued, and my parents decided to go to the local GP, my local GP, and I was referred to see a psychologist. And the psychologist I had, I don't remember much about the treatment he administered, so I can't sort of say whether or not it marries up to or complies with nice guidelines on what therapy should look like today. But I do remember him sort of getting me to challenge some of my intrusive thoughts by behaving in a different way. So, for example, I would always come out of school and ask my mum lots and lots of questions. A lot of them would be fueled by anxiety, and they'd be quite ritualistic. And the response changed. The psychologist asked me to actually come out of school and ask my mum how her day was first. And it just sort of changed, you know, the way that the rituals and then the compulsions, if you like, sort of went in sequence. So it turned out to be quite successful, and my symptoms went away. What I've since realised, and I will obviously be talking more about scrupulosity, is that although my childhood OCD seemed to be not related to morality, it's quite strange, because actually the underlying fear was fear of wasting water. There is a moral imperative there, and I haven't until really recently even acknowledged that had some accordance with obviously the OCD that I would later experience in adulthood. So my OCD had gone away, and it wasn't until my university years that my OCD returned. There must have been something about sort of travelling 300 miles away from where I lived in Norwich to Lancaster University, with all of the attendant bad weather, that set a perfectly ripe pretext for my OCD. And the accommodation I stayed in was actually so bad that a few years after I graduated, the whole building got knocked down. We had to make do with orange water from the taps. The shower cubicles, for some bizarre reason, didn't have a separation that went all the way down to the ground, and they were situated next to toilets and urinals, so other people's urine were free to flow into wherever who was having a shower. So it was pretty bad. But fortunately, my OCD wasn't around contamination, but the scatological environment nevertheless created a pretext for lots of intrusive thoughts. And my intrusive thoughts were largely centered around, am I a bad person? And I particularly was afraid of doing something non-consensual in a sexual context and thereby unforgivable. I think obviously being at that age and going to university and seeing obviously how people would meet and have, you know, in some cases casual sex, and we were going out clubbing all the time, something I hadn't been used to because I hadn't sort of gone out really very much before that and while I was at sixth form. So I guess all of this sort of really gave my OCD fuel for thought. And I would worry about things like, well, you know, if you're in a nightclub and you come across a member of the opposite sex that you find attractive, and there might be some opportunity to kiss them, as often people do, there's no written consent or verbal consent. How will I know for sure that there's consent? And if I go for it because I want to go for it, am I ignoring the possibility that that will be unwanted, and therefore I don't care about consent, and therefore that's the same as purposefully being non-consensual? So it had that sort of effect on me. And it's interesting because, and I think it's been touched on already by Blake, is that OCD tends to want to travel to the worst possible scenario. So the only thing that I can think of worse than being a sexual predator is being a paedophile. So of course there came the emergence of POCD. What happens if, you know, I'm attracted to children? What happens if I looked at that child in a sexual way, or it will be perceived that I've looked at that child in a sexual way, whether or not I was motivated in that way or not? And on top of the fact that these all had sort of very serious consequences in my mind, they were all unforgivable, there was this sort of presence of a grey area that was probably the worst platform, if you like, for OCD to grow, because actually the grey area is where all of some of these sort of darker thoughts emerge from, because the grey area is the conduit from sort of a normal moral life, in inverted commas, to an immoral life. It's an easy way to do something really, really bad. Look at a child's crotch. It's so easy to do. It's a grey area. We don't know how bad, in inverted commas, it is to look at somebody's crotch, but instantly, if you have fallen foul of what's right, you're a paedophile, and that is the worst possible case. So the grey area has always been a very dangerous place for me. And it's also really difficult sometimes to put into words your obsessions and compulsions, particularly in relation to moral scrupulosity, because as I've already sort of touched on, just through examples, we have lots of different elements, lots of different bits. It's almost as wide-ranging as the imagination permits. So I thought that I would bring it back to the OCD cycle, because we mustn't forget that the blueprint remains the same, and my thoughts, however tangential they are, will fit in with this overall paradigm. So here is an example for supposition. I have this quite regularly if I'm on a crowded train platform. The intrusive thought would be, did I brush past that woman on the train? Or if I believe I did do it, why did I brush past that woman on the train? And was it for sexual reasons? Could it have been avoided? Did I purposefully walk a little bit closer than I needed to? I can't remember. So the anxiety then fills my entire body. I feel sick. You know, you'll get the heartbeat rising, rapid breathing. You'd already at this point be starting to feel guilty, or you'd feel dread about the possibility of feeling guilty and of having done something that can't be forgiven. And then the compulsion will be obviously to review the incident in my head. Can I remember what I did and why? And going through it and try and picture it in my mind's eye. And I will check motives, and I would ask reassurance ultimately, and I might be asking myself reassurance. But, you know, often it is involving then other people, asking other people, well, would it have been bad if I was that close? And does it matter? And if it was just a motive, if it was a sexual motive and it was fleeting, is that such a big deal? How bad is it out of 10? And of course, all of these compulsions would try and get me to a more certain place where I can sort of be somewhat assured that I am not an unforgivable person, and then eventually the anxiety lowers until the next time. So that's pretty much how it works. You know, superimposing some of those very intricate thoughts onto the OCD map. So it's really important, with all that mental racket and all the refuse that travels around, to recognize the compulsions. And what's really interesting, and you know, in putting this presentation together and actually listing some of the rituals, is how many of them are cerebral. Not only are all of them capable of being cerebral, most of them are almost wholly cerebral, and yet, you know, to a large extent, they are an activity. They're just an activity that's going on in my head. So the first one, reassurance. Reassurance is very common. I think most people with OCD will attest to that. But I would ask reassurance for myself, to myself. So, for example, I might have looked at a family member's crotch or a child's crotch and instantly been overwhelmed with guilt, and I would seek reassurance about, you know, why I did it. And I might sort of try and to say to myself, well, there were mitigating factors, or you weren't concentrating, and it was saccadic eye movement. Then looking into, what does saccadic eye movement mean? Well, saccadic eye movement is often involuntary eye movement. Ah, that's brilliant. So I've read this article about saccadic eye movement. When it comes to what you look at, if there's a fast movement in your peripheral vision, you will focus on it. But if it's something that you find sexually attractive, that's apparently part saccadic, so it's sort of modulated. So there's an intent, there is a subconscious element to it, but there is also an intentional element to it. Or how much of it was intentional, etc., etc. And I'm reading and reassuring, and as you can see, it becomes enmeshed with other types of ritual behavior, like, for example, Googling and things like that. So reassurance and trying to mitigate your own actions, and try and work it through, is a big one for me. Checking as well, but not checking in the traditional sense that we understand it, but bodily sensations. And Blake mentioned groinal response. That's a common expression now. I think it sounds quite funny. Groinal response. Have I looked at an underage person for sexual reasons? One way of determining whether that's true is if I can feel anything down below. You know, has that been part of the whole process? I've mentioned checking my motives, because motives make a massive difference. And obviously the memory of the event, trying to check every facet of what I did by trying to sort of almost see myself as a character in a film, and rewinding the film over and over again to try and pinpoint the bits where I might be culpable or where I could let myself off the hook. Working things out is part of this, and working out what is bad and what is not bad. So sometimes I wouldn't even know if I've done something wrong, but I'd have to try and work out whether or not it was wrong. And that would get me drawing on philosophy and law and all the other, you know, places where I could sort of try and work out whether or not something's immoral or not. And I'd make rules. So I would try to live by rules to keep me safe from being bad. So, for example, I worried quite a lot about walking down the street and making eye contact with a woman if she was the only other person on the street, and especially if it was dark. So you can see already this is starting to sound like I've thought long and hard about how I could make rules up around that to make sure I don't do anything bad. And so I made rules up, for example, saying that you couldn't look at a person for any longer than 2 seconds. You couldn't look at any person at all if they were the only person on the street and it was beyond 9 o'clock. It went into that level of intricate illogicality, really. Of course, avoidance is there as well, because sometimes all of this is so exhausting. The easiest thing to do is just to avoid it entirely. Some places, for example, like schools, I would avoid if at all possible, because I was so likely to be triggered and have to go through all of this. that it was just easier just to steer well clear. And then this is another one that people do have, not me necessarily, although to some extent I do, and that is sort of neutralizing thoughts to try to compensate for a so-called bad thought, and that can sometimes also extend out to prayer. For those people that are religious, they may feel like prayer is one way of seeking sort of immediate forgiveness for, you know, whatever obsession or dark thought they might have had. And so obviously after university, entered into adulthood, and I'd studied law at school at university, and that's probably worth mentioning. I should have mentioned it slightly earlier. The fact that law is very moral. It's not so moral, but it touches on sort of moral issues, and it clearly had some very large part to play in my value system. And I think that OCD is well recognized for attacking people at their core values. But interestingly, going into law and actually practicing, I was a trainee solicitor in a criminal defense firm, none of that triggered my OCD, believe it or not. So morality remained my predominant theme, but I didn't have any problem defending people who had done possibly the worst crimes that we can think of. And I recognized that, you know, in order to sort of make sure that justice took place and the wheels of justice went round, you had to defend people who might have done some heinous things, and you have to put in those instances the prosecution to task, to proof. I guess so. For me, I then realized, actually, if my preoccupation is morals, why is it that I am able to do things that some people would say is immoral or something that they would struggle with? And I started to, especially with the obstinate way in which my OCD theme sort of stayed the same, so I like to think that perhaps this isn't about morality. Perhaps this is actually a medical condition, you know, more to do with, you know, what I was starting to read about OCD than it was to do about me being a morally bad person. So I obviously wanted at that point to get help for what I considered to now be OCD. So it took me a long time to realize that the problem, you know, was OCD. But trying to talk about it is really difficult because, first of all, mental illness in general it is enshrouded by taboo. People feel even now that it's difficult and it's something that they should feel ashamed of to talk about. But when you're talking about, you know, the fact that you've got intrusive thoughts about being a paedophile or harming children and that sort of thing, you find, and I've coined this expression, I don't know if somebody else has already, you find that you enter into territory that is a taboo within a taboo. It's a taboo just to sort of talk about mental illness sometimes, or that's how it felt. And within that, it feels like it's even worse talking about some of these really dark things that not a lot of people talk about and not a lot of people want to talk about. So that was difficult. And also it's difficult to sometimes put some of these intrusive thoughts and compulsions into words. What is it that I'm actually worrying about? You know, trying to actually articulate it can be really, really difficult. And unless you have lots of practice, which not many of us do, it can make you feel very isolated just by virtue of the fact that you don't feel like you've got a means by which you can, in language, relay your experiences to other people. So all of this did result in a long lag time in accessing help, which is an unfortunate thing. And obviously something that I wish I had addressed much sooner in my life. But having gone to get help and having tried numerous things and having continued to battle on for all of these years, I'm in a much better place now, and there are loads of things that have helped me massively. So the first thing I want to say is medication. Medication for me has been really transformative. I think that, you know, some people disagree, and maybe this is another taboo within a taboo, because there are some in the community who might not necessarily have such positive views about medication, but I think that it has been incredibly useful for me. When I first went to see a doctor about my OCD, they said that pills were sort of like the last resort and that I should try talk therapy, which I did, although I will go on to say that I didn't get the sort of ERP that would have helped me, you know, optimally at that time. And I ended up waiting 10 years before I actually tried medication, and it took 10 years before I went back to a doctor and said, well, actually, I really do think I want to try medication because I'm at my wit's end and really suffering. And they were fully behind the decision. So it just shows you that actually things change, and sometimes doctors don't even get it right. But, you know, latterly, I was very glad to have received medication. Support groups as well. So the time that you wait for therapy and all the bits in between therapy and before I took medication, support groups were my lifeline, because it felt so absolutely. I mean, Olivia's touched on it as well about meeting like-minded people. To find that other people are experiencing what you're experiencing, especially when you feel like, oh, I'm this murky person and nobody else thinks like me, is so enlivening. And it was amazing to me as well within support groups to find so many people who, when I mentioned my Puro manifestation, my moral scrupulosity, all could relate, and many of them had OCD subtypes that perhaps didn't affect them as much as it affected me, but that touched on the subjects that I worried about. And it was really quite enlivening to not to know that they were suffering, but to know that it was far more common than I thought. So support groups have been fantastic for me. Finding balance, you know, I don't work in law at the moment, but I do have a full-time job. I found that having a work-life balance has been really helpful. Working in a law firm was difficult, and although it didn't trigger the specifics of my OCD, the stress sort of added to the underlying anxiety. But at times where I haven't had enough to do, and where, for example, I skipped lectures at university and stuff, I found that too much time to think wasn't a great idea either. So very happy to be in a job now that's full-time, that isn't overly stressful, and allows me to find that balance, which keeps me, I think on kilter. The myth that ERP is not possible for Puro is the one thing that I would say I have to re-emphasize, and hopefully people will go away remembering this. I have not had proper CBT with ERP. I've had CBT, and we've talked about lots of different techniques around trying to challenge intrusive thoughts by changing behaviors, but I haven't actually had I haven't actually had intense ERP, and I wish I had, because I do believe that with the right therapist and with techniques such as imaginal exposure, you can probably do a really good job in undermining Puro, just as much as you can undermine any of the other subtypes of OCD. Relapse is not failure. I mean, I've been recovering now since I was 19, 20, and I'm now 37. So I've relapsed a good few times, but every time I relapse, I remember that I've done it before. And every time I remember I've done it before, I actually managed to find the strength to do it again. And I learned something different that I didn't know the first time when I go through the process again. So I'm not saying that I enjoy sort of constantly relapsing, but relapsing is inevitable. And I have to say that currently I haven't relapsed for a good few years, and I live a relatively OCD free life. I can manage my OCD and have an extraordinary quality of life where I can do things like this, where I can hold down a full-time job. I've just bought a house that I'm moving into. All of these things probably weren't possible while I was so inundated with intrusive thoughts and feelings of dread and anxiety and guilt. So I want to end this on saying that recovery is possible, and I might even go as far as to say that perhaps in the future I'll even get some ERP specifically tailored for my Puro, which might make me even better in the future. Who knows? But that's me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Aron. I'm so grateful for you speaking so openly. I think you are what can only be described as really a rare gift to the OCD community. You are, I think, sharing your lived experience of sexually intrusive thoughts, or as you called it, those more taboo thoughts, has such a huge impact. It's really only by kind of shining a light on these areas that people will be able to talk more openly and seek treatment in the way that you described it. So I think you will have brought huge hope to people this evening, and just a huge thank you from me personally, but also on behalf of everybody listening this evening. And I hope you're going to stay around for questions, because I think people will be really pleased to share more with you during the Q&A. We are going to start our panel now. So if I can welcome Dr. Stobie and Olivia and Aron to turn on their cameras. Hope everybody had a chance to briefly get a drink and move around a bit. Okay, so we have lots of questions coming in. You can see in the chat there are a good number have come through, nearly 100. I would just jump straight into the questions, if that's okay, and I will start by directing them at people, but then if anybody wants to jump in at any stage, please do. So Dr. Stobie, I think the first question is probably for you. So there were a couple of questions about whether CBT needs to be adapted at all when it's particularly treating pure O, and whether you've got any comment to make on that.
Yes, I mean, I think the basic principles still apply, but as I kind of touched on very briefly, with you know, any type of CBT treatment needs to be modified a little bit just for OCD, sort of pure OCD, pure or not. And particularly like the type of CBT where you're sort of helping people to kind of reason their way out of things, or kind of think about alternative ways of thinking about things. Often that's not going to be particularly helpful if you're helping somebody with OCD. It's going to be much more about tolerating uncertainty and kind of not getting into the debates, I think, in the first place. And I think that's particularly the case for pure O, that's even more so. And as I said, I personally quite like loop tapes. It's a very old kind of behavioral technique, but it works really well, where you kind of record the thoughts that are bothering you and kind of practice listening to them and not responding to them. And then there's some quite helpful techniques which you kind of adopt from a little bit from mindfulness sometimes, and sometimes from work on generalized anxiety, worry, about kind of how to have thoughts and kind of practice not engaging with them or not actively engaging with them. So those would be some of the differences, I guess, that we might focus on.
Thank you. That's really helpful for people to understand some of those differences and have those really specific examples around things like loop tapes, etc. And I mean, this doesn't directly follow on, but for both Aron and Olivia, just thinking about your talks and how much you shared at the end about how you are able to manage your OCD really well at this time. There were a lot of questions about whether you had any specific kind of tools in your toolbox at the moment that you could share that people might find really helpful. Is there anything there that either of you wanted to speak to? Aron, do you want to go first, and then Olivia?
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps I was slightly dismissive of the therapy I've received in respect of the ERP element, because one thing that I do and practice regularly is recognizing that I've got an OCD thought and mapping it back to that drawing that I showed in my presentation, and being able to say, this is OCD, stop. And that is, it's easier said than done, but it is a form of exposure, because what I'm saying is that whatever I am worrying about, whatever thought that is making me feel very anxious and guilty, the urge to solve it has to be sort of cut dead before I even go down that road. I have to recognize that this is an OCD thought, and I have to take the risk that it might not be an OCD thought, and that I really am about to ignore something that's telling me you're a bad person, you must do something about it. But I have to be able to take the risk, and I have to be able to map it back to the OCD cycle. And by cutting it off at the compulsive bit and not engaging in ritual thinking, I am practicing ERP. So that helps me.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. Olivia, is there anything you wanted to add or specifically share?
I think what Aron said is super helpful, and definitely something that I would do as well. I think something that I would do, which I sort of touched on in the presentation, is to challenge myself when I feel well, like to kind of almost push the boundaries when I'm having a good day. And that might be as simple as, you know, I don't know, the dog comes in from a walk, and instead of being like, oh, I'll wipe her paws on the mat or whatever, is just actually sitting on the floor with her and giving her a hug, and sort of proactively putting myself in a situation where, okay, well, she's been outside, her feet are probably dirty, they might have stood in something, but I'm going to get on the floor and just do something that I want to do and challenge my OCD, even if I'm not feeling anxious. I think that, I guess, on a day-to-day basis probably helps to keep me well, because it's hard challenging yourself when you do feel anxious, and I think that's very important. But also to stop, I guess, you know, falling back into old habits is just to really push the boundaries every day. And something I learned in therapy is that you almost have to go like past the point of normal to get back to the point of normal. And, you know, sometimes, you know, sitting outside in the garden, you know, if it's a bit wet or muddy, people wouldn't necessarily do that because it's wet and muddy. But sometimes when you've got OCD or you've had really bad OCD in the past, you kind of have to put yourself in those, you know, almost abnormal situations to get back to that level of normal. So yeah, just challenging myself when I'm having a good day, I think helps keep me well.
Thank you. That's really that's super helpful, I think, and really helpful to have such clear examples of what you both do. Dr. Stobie, Olivia and Aron have really talked clearly about how they manage their OCD on a day-to-day basis. There's quite a few questions about whether it is actually possible to recover completely from OCD. I don't know if that's something you have any thoughts or comment on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the guideline that we kind of go by is a sort of rule of thirds. So usually in terms of people having therapy, we find that about a third of people will either recover fully or make very significant progress. About a third of people will make progress but still have quite a lot of OCD in their lives, and about a third of people will not make significant progress, I guess, with the OCD. There was a very interesting study, I think it was done by Skog and Skog, who are psychiatrists in Sweden, in a very small part of the countryside in Sweden. And I think it was a father and son, or father and daughter possibly, where the father was a psychiatrist in that area for 25 years, and then the child took over for the next 25 years, and they did this sort of follow-up of people with OCD over a very long period of time because they knew people, and it actually makes a quite optimistic reading. Like within the study, it's not particularly very scientifically controlled, but it showed for a lot of people that their symptoms kind of improved spontaneously over time without much kind of intervention. It's very hard to say because, you know, I work in a clinic with people with severe and treatment-resistant OCD, so not everybody we see has got a happy ending, and I think that can also be demoralizing if everyone's saying, yes, it's completely treatable and it will go away completely. Everybody is different, but I think where people are, you know, especially listening to Olivia and Aron too, in kind of different stages, you know, Olivia's chart of kind of different points in the journey. I think where people have got to the point where they understand what it is and what they need to do, and they're getting good help for that, then I think the outlook is very positive for that. And that will look different, obviously, for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful reflection. And I think your comment on Olivia's chart, it was a really helpful chart, and I think I would really encourage people to hold that in their mind when kind of thinking about that question and recovery. I think
we sometimes have this idea of recovery as being a very nice straight line, because of going straight up. And I think for all of us in different settings, it doesn't normally look like that when you're learning anything. It's usually not, you don't advance in a straight line, I think. And as long as you're learning helpful things and trying your best, I think that's a very good predictive of good outcome.
Yeah. And I think that was the bit that I kind of took from what both Olivia and Aron said about, you know, good quality of life. There was a question that came through from a lot of people, and actually you all might have something to say on what this kind of looks like and means from your perspective, but maybe Dr. Stobie, if we can start with you, is the question was around what tolerating uncertainty looks like and what that means when, because I think everybody's kind of talked about it a bit in their individual presentations. Perhaps you could start, Dr. Stobie, and then Olivia and Aron might have something to add from a kind of lived experience perspective.
Yes, so tolerating uncertainty, again, like as with a lot of these difficult things, always easy to kind of say the soundbite than it is to actually put it into practice, I think. And particularly if it's something that's very anxiety inducing for you, the more anxious you get about something or the more personally salient something is, the harder it's going to be to tolerate that uncertainty. But, you know, the therapy that we do is quite slow, and it's not sort of just talking to people, it's kind of really listening to them as well. And we start off with sort of thinking about like person's history, why they kind of picked up the beliefs that they have, the role of uncertainty in their lives and their families, and then start to develop a kind of less threatening way of thinking about things and kind of think, is this strategy of trying to gain more certainty, how is that working out for you in this area? And is it even possible within the content that you've kind of fixed on? And we start to try to encourage people to sort of experiment with that and kind of find out, you know, could there be other ways of doing this? And just sort of suspend your disbelief for a while. Let's try and give it a couple of weeks and see whether trying a different way could be more helpful to you, and whether this is a preferable way to live your life. And I think we start quite gently with that and try and get some specific gains. But it's really encouraging people to test it out for themselves and see whether A, they can manage it, and B, if it's helpful for them. And where people can manage it, it's inevitably kind of extremely helpful. But it is a very, very difficult thing to do for all of us in anything that's kind of important and scary.
Thank you ever so much. That's a really helpful way to kind of think about the journey. Olivia or Aron, was there anything that you wanted to kind of think about in terms of that process from your own personal perspectives?
Yeah, I guess I would echo what Dr. Stobie said about, like, it's the most difficult thing. Like, it's so hard to turn your brain off when you're sitting there and you've got an intrusive thought that at the time genuinely feels like a life or death situation. It feels horrible. What I find helpful now, and I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but is thinking back to like a previous intrusive thought or a previous time where I was struggling to cope with that uncertainty, and thinking about, like, did seeking that certainty in that moment for something I'm not anxious about anymore, for an intrusive thought that's now passed, did it help? Did it bring any certainty? And obviously there's no certainty really in anything, and that's kind of what OCD is kind of seeking 100% when we can't be 100% about anything. So yeah, I find kind of thinking back about, okay, well, that intrusive thought weeks ago, that at the time felt like the worst thing ever, but I didn't seek certainty on that, and now it's not even bothering me now. So I know that I'm kind of almost wasting my time by doing that. I'm not going to have that 100% that I absolutely need. Like I say, completely easier said than done, but that's just something that now, having gone through therapy, I find quite helpful to do.
Thank you, and thank you for the honesty around that. I think that's really important for people to hear about how hard it is. Aron, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? And what Olivia said just sort of like brings it home. We have probably hundreds of thousands of the same intrusive thoughts or similar intrusive thoughts, and they always get sort of put into the OCD bin, and yet the OCD intrusive thought will come again, and without bearing any mind to the statistical likelihood of it not being OCD, we go down that same sort of like path where we actually want to believe that there is a real and genuine threat. I think that for me, tolerating the uncertainty comes down to an understanding of the fact that the person, not the person, the thing that's telling you that life is uncertain is also an uncertain bet, that the OCD itself, the OCD voice, is an uncertain and largely untrustworthy voice. So I tell myself that I'm very, very much likely being lied to. So that's a good starting point for then not reacting straight away. And then I try and sort of say to myself, I can't solve this now. Am I a bad person? Do I need to know if I'm a bad person at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Perhaps I can wait till 6 o'clock this evening to work out whether or not I'm an all-time bad person. Nothing's going to happen from between 3 and 6 o'clock. So I push it back. I try and shelf it and say, look, if it's that important, I'll come back to it. What happens is your anxiety does go down by itself quite often. And when it comes to the point where you said, I'll have to revisit it, you don't need to, and you put it off again. So I find that rather than trying to stop having a thought, which is almost impossible, I put it off and put it off and put it off, because I am trying to undermine the urgency with which my OCD tries to tell me that there's a threat. And that has helped me to sort of deal more and more with the uncertainty side of OCD.
Thank you, Aron. And by the look on Olivia's face, that's something that really resonates. And so again, thank you for the really practical comment there. I think that will have really helped people. There's been a lot of questions tonight about the links between OCD and autism, and we will be running a specific session on that later in our webinar series. But just a question, and I don't know if you have comment on this, Dr. Stobie, about whether there is more, whether Puro is more common in people with autism and perhaps ADHD.
I don't actually know that, to be honest. It may well be the case. I haven't kind of noticed that, but I'm not really sure about that, I'm afraid.
We'll try and come back to that in one of the future sessions, because as I say, we have noticed there's been quite a few questions on it. And then we've probably got time for one or perhaps 2 more questions. So there's a question here from a parent, or we've had quite a few questions from parents who want to know how they might be able to support their child who is perhaps not talking about the thoughts that are sitting behind the compulsions, and how that might be helpful. So and how they can help other than physically kind of intervening in stopping the compulsions. So I don't know, perhaps Dr. Stobie, if you have any thoughts on that, and then Olivia and Aron, if there's any comments you want to make, as both having talked about OCD as children.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting phenomenon. So if you kind of look at sort of magical thinking OCD and superstitious sort of OCD, it's very, very prevalent in children, and it's very common, obviously, for children to be worrying about their parents and worrying about their family, and not necessarily able to articulate what they're worried about, what those causal kind of links are between what they're worried about and the rituals that they're doing. And that sort of tends to die off, and it sort of reduces in adolescence and reduces again still further in adulthood. So obviously for some people it does kind of run through as a theme all the way through, but it's very interesting to see how common that is. And I think, you know, we ask everyone who comes to our clinic about where it started and how it began, and many people kind of reported sort of beginning in childhood. And some of those people really weren't able to articulate it. You can kind of infer from the rituals that they're doing what it must have been about, you know, and particularly if you know a little bit about what was happening in their lives at the time. But some people also would report that they had a very clear idea about what the rituals were about and why they're doing them. But it's easier to get adults to feel back by just saying, I don't know, leave me alone. I just need to touch the pillow 7 times, and that's just how it is, I guess. I don't think you always necessarily have to know what the thoughts are that underpin something. It never hurts to know that. It's always helpful where you can, but you can still get very far, I think, just with a purely kind of exposure-based approach, even if you don't know what the thoughts necessarily are, and kind of gently encouraging children to try to reduce or cut their rituals out, I guess, too. But obviously better if you are able to work that out. And sometimes, as I said, you can be a detective and work backwards from looking at the rituals trying to figure out what's going on, or sort of thinking about stresses in that child's life and that they're things they're particularly worried about at the time. It kind of makes a lot of sense, I guess, why people would be stressed out, and also trying to prevent anything bad from happening to their families. So yeah, but I'm sure Olivia and Aron have got some kind of useful comments on that too.
Thank you. Olivia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I guess I was one of I guess I was one of the children in that situation for a while, and that I didn't really know kind of what the thought was behind it, and it was just that kind of feeling of not feeling right. And then when my sort of contamination related fear started, I didn't know what the fear was. I knew it wasn't being ill. I didn't know it was a fear around smell. So I actually was encouraged to go to therapy without knowing that. And actually that came out through the therapy, which I found really helpful. And I remember saying to my therapist, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. And it kind of came out through those sessions. So yeah, I think, like you were saying, Dr. Stobie, just kind of going to the sessions any way you can kind of uncover that as you're kind of going through. I think if it's the case of someone, a child who knows their intrusive thoughts but doesn't feel comfortable sharing them, then something we kind of speak about a lot on the helpline is, hearing all the young people's experiences, because you can hear it from a professional or a parent, and you could, be like, well, that's a professional saying it to me, or that's my mum saying it to me, or my dad. But actually, if you hear it from another young person, like, oh, I have these intrusive thoughts about this, and I think that's where, OCD Action youth services and videos and podcasts and books and things are really helpful, because they can help someone, I guess, open up and feel able to be like, okay, I don't feel comfortable sharing my thoughts, but my thoughts are like the ones in this video. And then, that's an easier way of kind of telling someone about your thoughts. So if that's the case, that's what I would recommend personally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm really aware that we have come to the end of our time together this evening. I just want to thank all of our panelists. I think they have been each wonderful and inspiring, and just have shown such generosity of spirit in the way that they have shared and spoken. I wish we could all hear the enormous round of applause, but such is our platform that we can't. We will be running another webinar in this time in the first week of August. So please do sign up. We have a newsletter which will tell you about that, and you can track that on our website. We also will be sharing the recording of this kind of towards the end of this week. So if you've missed anything of it, you will be able to share that then. So I just remains with me to say an enormous thank you to everybody. And I look forward to seeing you in a month's time. Thank you.